Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons, Chapter 20. Her day with Judith in London was a complete success, though there were, it is true, some minor disadvantages. Judith's hair, for example, fell down every 15 minutes and had to be repinned by Flora. Then there were the sympathetic and interested inquiries of fellow travelers to be fobbed off, who were naturally intrigued by hearing Judith refer to herself at intervals as a used gourd and a rind. But when once the journey was over, Flora's worries were over as well. Seated opposite Dr. Moodell and Judith at a quiet table near a window in Grimaldi's, she watched with a feeling of relief Dr. Moodell taking command of the situation. It is one of the disagreeable duties of a state pseudo-psychoanalyst to remove his affections of his patients from the embarrassing objects upon which they were concentrated and focus them instead upon himself. It was true that they did not remain focused there for long. As soon as he could, he switched them on to something harmless, like chess or gardening. But while they were focused upon himself, he had a rather thin time of it and earned every penny of the $800 a year paid to him by a judicious government. And Flora, observing how soon Judith began to glow darkly and do the slumbering volcano act in Dr. Moodell's direction, could not help admiring the practiced skill with which he had effected the transference in the course of the commonplace conversation throughout lunch. "She will be all right now," he murmured soothingly to Flora in an undertone when lunch was over, while Judith was gazing broodingly out of the window at the busy street below. "I shall take her to the nursing home and let her talk to me. There she will stay for 6 months, perhaps. Then I send her abroad for a little holiday. I make her interested in old churches. I think, yes, old churches. There are many in Europe, and it will take her the rest of her life to see them all. She has money, yes? You must have money in order to see all the old churches you want. Well, that is all right, then. Do not distress yourself. She will be quite happy. All that energy. It is a pity, yes, it all turns in instead of out. Now I turn it out. On to the old churches, yes." Flora felt a little uneasy. It was not the first time she had seen a distraught patient grow calm beneath the will of the analyst. Yet she had never grown used to the spectacle. Would Judith really be happier? She looked doubtfully at her cousin. Certainly Judith looked happier already. Her eyes followed every movement Dr. Moodell had paid as he paid the bill for lunch. Flora had never seen her look so animated and normal. "I understand you are going to stay with Dr. Moodell for a while, Cousin Judith," she said. "He has asked me. He is very kind. There is a dark force in him," returned Judith. "It beats like a black gong. I wonder you do not feel it." "Oh, well, we can't all strike lucky," said Flora amiably. "But really, Judith, I do think it would be quite a sound scheme if you went. You need a holiday, you know, after all the fuss there's been at home lately. It will do you no end of good, set you up and whatnot. And then, after a bit, you might go abroad and see some of the sights of Europe, old churches and all that. Don't worry about the farm. Reuben will look after that for you, and send you a fat piece out of the takings every month." "Amos," muttered Judith. She looked as though the threads which bound her to her old life were snapping one by one, yet still held her in a frail tenure. "Oh, I wouldn't fuss about him," said Flora eagerly. "He's gone off to America with the Reverend Elderbury Shiftglass by now, I shouldn't wonder. He'll let you know when he's coming back. Don't you bother. Don't you bother. You enjoy yourself while you're young." This was what Judith had evidently decided to do, for she drove off with Dr. Moodell in his car, looking quite content. At least she looked illuminated. At least she looked illumined and transfigured and reft out of herself, and all the rest of it, even when allowances were made for her habit of multiplying every emotion she felt by twice its own weight. She probably was feeling fairly chirpy. Before they said goodbye, Flora arranged to send on to the nursing home for the 5 dirty red shawls and sundry bundles of hairpins which seemed to make up the greater part of Judith's wardrobe, and also a comfortable sum of money which should pay for her pleasures during the next 6 months. Dr. Moodell could, of course, be trusted to see that her funds were properly administered. So that was all settled, and Flora watched the doctor's car drive away with feelings of considerable satisfaction. It was with a feeling of satisfaction, too, and with something strangely like affection, that she caught her first glimpse of the farmhouse on her return that night to Cold Comfort. It was a mild and lovely evening. The rays of the sun looked heavy, as they frequently do toward the approach of a summer sunset, and lay between the tunnels of green leaves like long rods of gold. There were no clouds in the blue sky, whose color was beginning to deepen with the advantage of night, and the face of the whole countryside was softened by the shadows, which were slowly growing in the depths of the woods and hedgerows. The farmhouse itself no longer looked like a beast about to spring. Not that it ever had, to her, for she was not in the habit of thinking that things looked exactly like other things which were as different from them in appearance as it was possible to be, but it had looked dirty and miserable and depressing, and when Mr. Mybug had once remarked that it looked like a beast about to spring, Flora had simply not had the heart to contradict him. Now it looked dirty and miserable and depressing no longer. Its windows flung back the gold of the sunset, the yard was swept clear of straws and paper, check curtains hung crisply at most of the windows, and someone, as a matter of fact it was Ezra who had a secret yen for horticulture, had been digging and trimming up the garden, and there were already rows of beans and red flower. "I," thought Flora, simply, as she leant forward in the buggy and surveyed the scene, "did all that with my little hatchet," and a feeling of joy and content opened inside her like a flower. But then she looked upward at the closed blank face of the window immediately above the kitchen door, and her face grew pensive again. Aunt Ada's room. Aunt Ada was still there, fighting her losing battle. Aunt Ada, the spirit of Cold Comfort, was hard-pressed but still undefeated. And could she, Flora, really congratulate herself upon her work at the farm, and flatter herself that the end of that work was in sight, while Aunt Ada Doom still brooded aloft in her tower? "Yet supper's on the table. Your supper's on the table, Duck," said Mrs. Beadle, opening the gate to let Reuben lead Viper into the yard. "Cold veal and salad. I'm off home now. Oh, and there's a blancmange, pink." "Lovely," said Flora, with a sigh of pleasure, as she climbed down from the buggy. "Thank you, Mrs. Beadle. Miss Judith won't be back tonight. She's going to stay in London for a while." "Has everything been all right? She took on something awful about Miss Judith going off this morning," said Mrs. Beadle, lowering her voice and glancing significantly upwards at the closed window. "Said she was all alone in the woodshed now, and no mistake. She says she don't count Reuben. She wouldn't, of course, him being the pick of the bunch. Still, she keeps her appetite. I will say that for her. 3 helpings of veal, and 2 of suet roly for dinner tonight. Can you beat it? Well, this won't buy the baby a new frock. Good night, Miss Flora. I'll be here 8 sharp tomorrow," and off she went. Flora went into the kitchen, where the lamp already burned on the table. Its soft light fell into the hearts of a bunch of pink roses in a jam jar. There was a letter from Charles propped against the jar, too, and the roses threw down a heavy rounded shadow on the envelope. It was so pretty that Flora lingered a moment, looking before she opened her letter. The serene weather held, and Flora and everybody was hoping that it would last until Elfine's wedding reception at the farm on the 14th of June, which was Midsummer Day. The preparations for this reception were now Flora's chief care. She was anxious that the farm should not disgrace Reuben and his sister. She went frankly to the former and told him that she must have money to buy decorations and a feast for the wedding guests. Reuben seemed pleased at the idea of holding the reception at the farm, and gave her £30 with which to do her damnedest. But, he added, glancing menacingly at the ceiling, "What about the old un?" "Leave it to me," said Flora decidedly. "I'm thinking out a plan for coping with her. and in a few days I am going to try it out." "Well, thank you so much for this money, my lamb. I will see about decorations and food at once. Oh, and need we have all the pictures wreathed with that smelly sook bind? I am afraid it might have a bad effect on Miriam and Rennet. They're so easily upset." "'Tis no choice of mine. 'Tis grandmother's choice. Do as you please, Cousin Flora. I never wants to see a sprig of it again." So, armed with his permission, Flora began her preparations. The days passed pleasantly. She had plenty to do, and even paid 3 visits to town, for she was having a new dress made for the reception, and it had to be fitted. Mrs. Smiling was still abroad. She was not expected home until the day after the wedding, so one mouse place was shut up. Julia was in Cannes with Claude Hart Harris at home in Chiswick, whence he repaired every summer for a month, because, he said, he could at least be sure of meeting no one he knew there, but Flora could amuse herself, and dined and lunched in pleasant solitude. In the intervals of fitting her dress, and superintending a simply colossal spring cleaning of the farm, the first it had received for 100 years, Flora kept a weather eye upon the affair of Mr. Mybug and Rennet. She thought it would be best, of course, if they got married, but she was well aware that marriage was not the intellectual's long suit, and she did not want Rennet landed with a shameful bundle. Mr. Mybug, however, did ask Rennet to marry him. He said that, by God, D.H. Lawrence was right when he had said there must be a dumb, dark, dull, bitter-belly tension between a man and a woman. And how else could this be achieved, save in the long monotony of marriage? As for Rennet, she accepted him at once, and was perfectly happy choosing saucepans. So that was all right. And they were to be married at a registry office one weekend in town, and have a share in Elfine's reception on the 14th. As the evenings grew longer toward Midsummer Day, Flora would sit alone in the little green parlor, where the scent of the May-tree came in through the open window, reading in the Higher Common Sense the chapter on preparing the mind for the twin invasion by prudence and daring in dealing with substances not included in the outline. It would help her, she knew, to deal with Aunt Ada Doom. Those long words in German and in Latin were solemn and cragged as Egyptian monoliths, and when the reader peered more closely into the meanings of their symbols, that rang like bells backwards and backwards into time, they were seen to be frosted with wisdom, cold and irrefutable. Before them, passion awed slunk back to its lair, and divine reason and her sister love, locked in one another's arms, raised their twin heads to receive the wreath of happiness. Aunt Ada was more empathically one of the substances not inclined in the outline as Flora read on. Evening after evening she was aware that a conviction was growing in her mind that this was one of the cases, the chapter warned the student that such might exist, in which she must meekly await the help of a flash of intuition. The chapter would help her prepare her mind for the invasion. But it could do no more. She must await the moment. And on an evening of more than common peace and beauty, the moment came. She put aside the Higher Common Sense for half an hour while she partook in her supper, and had opened Mansfield Park at random to refresh her spirits. It was over, however, at last, and the evening set in with much more composure to Fanny, and suddenly, the flash. It was over indeed. Her long indecision and her bewilderment about how to deal with Aunt Ada Doom. In a few seconds she had her plan clearly in her head, with every detail as distinct as though the scheme had already been carried through. Calmly she detached a leaf from her pocketbook and wrote the following telegram: Hart Harris, Chauncey Grove, Chiswick Mall. Please send at once latest number Vogue, also Prospectus Hotel Miramar, Paris, and very important photographs. Fanny Ward. Love, Flora. Then she summoned Mark Dollar's Nancy, who had come in to help with the spring cleaning, and sent her down to the post office in Howling with the telegram. As Nancy ran off through the clear summer twilight, Flora reverently shut the covers of the Higher Common Sense. She needed it no longer. It could remain closed until the next time she encountered a substance not included in the outline. And she retired to bed that night in the calm confidence that she had found a way to deal with Aunt Ada Doom. There was now only a week to go before the wedding, so Flora hoped very much that Claude would send at once the papers for which she had asked. It would probably take time to deal with Aunt Ada, but no time must be wasted if her aim was to be achieved by the day of the wedding. But Claude did not fail her. The papers arrived by airmail at noon the next day. They were dropped neatly into the great field by the air postman, and were accompanied by a plaintive note from Claude asking her what in heck she was up to now. He said that except for the fact that she was larger, she reminded him of a mosquito. Flora undid the parcel and made quite sure that all the things for which she had asked were there. Then she recoiled her hair and put on a fresh linen dress, and, as it was luncheon time, directed Mrs. Beadle to give to her the tray upon which was arranged Aunt Ada's lunch. "Go on, you'll strain yourself," said Mrs. Beadle. "It weighs about for underweight." But Flora quickly took the tray, and under the best thought eyes of Mark Dollar's Nancy, Reuben, Mrs. Beadle, and Sue, Phoebe, Jane, and Letty, she arranged upon it a copy of Vogue, the prospectus of the Hotel Miramar in Paris, and the photographs of Fanny Ward. "I am going to take her lunch up to Aunt Ada," she announced. "If I have not come down by 3 o'clock, Miss Beadle, will you kindly bring up some lemonade? At 4:30 you may bring up tea and some of that currant cake Phoebe made last week. If I am not down by 7 o'clock, please bring up a tray with supper for 2, and we will have hot milk and biscuits at 10. Now goodbye, all of you. I beg you not to worry. All will be well." And slowly, before the fascinated gaze of the Starkatters and Mrs. Beadle, Flora began to mount up the stairs which led to Aunt Ada's chamber, bearing the tray of lunch steadily before her. They heard the light sound of her footsteps receding along the corridor. They paused, and the listeners heard the airy summer stillness of the house, her tap on the door, and her clear voice saying, "I have brought you your lunch, Aunt Ada. May I come in? It is Flora." There was a silence, then the door was heard to open, and Flora and the tray of lunch passed within. That was the last time anyone heard or saw of her for nearly 9 hours. At 3 o'clock, at 4:30, and at 7 o'clock, Mrs. Beadle took up refreshments as she had been instructed. Each time she returned, she found the empty plates and cups packed neatly outside the closed door. From within there came the steady rise and fall of voices, but though she listened for many minutes, she could not distinguish a word, and this disappointing piece of information was all she had to carry back to the eagerly waiting group downstairs. At 7 o'clock, Mr. Mybug and Rennet joined the band of watchers, and after waiting until nearly 8 o'clock for Flora to come downstairs, they decided that it would be best to begin without her, and made their supper off beef, beer, pickled onions, pleasantly spiced by anxiety and speculation. After dinner they settled down once more to watch and wait. Mrs. Beadle wondered a dozen times if she should not just run up with a few sandwiches and some cocoa at 9 in order to see whether there were any developments to be observed. But Reuben said no, she was not to. She had been told to take up hot milk at 10 o'clock, and hot milk at 10 she should take. He would not have Flora's instructions disobeyed by the tiniest detail, so she stayed where she was. They all got very cozy, sitting round the open door in the lingering twilight. Presently Mrs. Beadle made them all some barley water flavored with lemon, and they sat, sipping it comfortably, for their throats were quite sore with talking and wondering what on earth Flora could be saying to Aunt Ada Doom, and recalling details of the farm's history for the past 20 years, and reminding each other what a nuisance old Fig Starkatter had always been, and wondering how Seth was getting on in Hollywood, and whether he would run into Amos there, and saying how lovely Elfine's wedding was going to be, and wondering how Irk and Miriam would get on when they were married, and speculating as to what on earth Judith was doing in London, and if so, why and who with. It grew slowly dark and cooler outside, and the summer stars came out. They were talking away so hard that they never heard the clock struck 10, and it was not until nearly 1/4 that Mrs. Beadle suddenly made them all jump by leaping from her chair and saying loudly, "There now, I forgot the milk. I'll forget me own name next. I'll take it up at once." And she was just going over the range to put wood on the ashes when a sound outside made them start and turn their heads in the direction of the dark doorway of the kitchen. Someone was coming downstairs with light steps that dragged a little. Reuben stood up and lit a match, which he held above his head. The light slowly grew, and through the dark doorway walked Flora at last. She looked composed enough, but rather pale and sleepy, and a curl of her dark gold hair hung loose against her cheek. "Hello," she said pleasantly. "You're all here, then? Hello, Mr. Mybug. Surely it's time you were in bed. Can I have that milk now, please, Mrs. Beadle? I'll drink it down here. You need not take any up to Aunt Ada. I've put her to bed. She's asleep." There was a gasp of wonder from everybody. Flora sank into Reuben's empty chair with a long yawn. "We was feared for his soul," said Letty reprovingly after a pause, in which lamps were lit and curtains drawn. Nobody liked to ask any questions, though they were all pop-eyed with curiosity. "Done a many times we came near up to fetch ye down again." "Too nice of you," said Flora languidly, with one eye on the preparation of the milk. "But it was quite all right, really. Everything's settled now. You need not worry. Reuben, there will be no fuss at the wedding or anything. We can go right ahead with the food and the decorations. In fact, everything ought to be rather good in one way and another. Cousin Flora, no one but he could have done it, said Reuben simply. I suppose he would tell us how it was done? Well, said Flora, diving into the milk. It's a long story, you know. We talked for hours. I can't possibly tell you all we said. It would take all night. Here, she repressed a vast yawn. You'll see when the time comes, on the wedding day, I mean. You wait. It will be a surprise, a lovely surprise. I can't tell you now. It would spoil things. You just wait and see. It will be simply lovely. It will be simply lovely. Surprise. Her voice had been growing sleepier and sleepier toward the end of her speech. And just as it finally dwindled into silence, Mrs. Beetle darted forward and was just too late to catch the glass of milk as it fell from her hand. She was asleep. Like a tired child, said Mr. Mybug, who, like most of your brutal intellectuals, was as soft as a cheese underneath. Just like a little tired child. And he was just reaching out in a dreamy, absent kind of way to stroke Flora's hair when Mrs. Beetle gave a sharp dab at his hand, exclaiming, Paws off, Pompey! Which so much upset him that he marched off home, pursued by the wailing Rennet, without pausing to make any farewells. Mrs. Beetle then shoved Susan, Letty, Phoebe, Prue, and Jane off to their own chambers, and with the assistance of Reuben, roused Flora from her slumber. She stood up, still very sleepily, and smiled at Reuben as she took her candle from his hand. Good night, Cousin Flora. 'Twere a good day for cold comfort when first ye came here, he said, looking down at her. My dear soul, don't name it. It's been the most enormous diversion to me, said Flora. Just you wait until the wedding day, though. That is going to be fun. If you like, Mrs. Beetle, you know how I dislike making complaints, but the cutlets Mrs. Starcatter and I had for supper was slightly underdone. We both noticed it. Mrs. Starcatter's, indeed, was almost raw. I'm sorry, I'm sure, Mrs. Post, said Mrs. Beetle, and then everybody went sleepily up to bed. And that is the end of chapter 20.